Welcome. This narrated lore features excerpts of codices and publications, old and new. It is blended with my own writing and edited for a pleasant listening experience. The lore covered extends from the First Armageddon War to the Third, revealing the events leading up to the legendary Battle of Helsreach. If you enjoy this content, please don't forget to like the video and leave a comment about what lore you'd like me to cover next. Without further ado, let's begin. Within the Eye of Terror, the forces of chaos are constantly at war against each other. On occasions, however, the Chaos Gods put aside their personal rivalries and join together to mount a large-scale invasion. The assembly of such an invasion force is often triggered when a space hulk drifts past a demon world. These ancient spaceships can be used to transport vast armies through the warp. Driven and tossed by the currents of the warp, no one can predict where and when they will reappear. So it is virtually impossible for the Imperium to predict where chaos will strike next. Usually, the attack occurs within a few light years of the Eye of Terror, but sometimes a hulk will drop out of the warp in a system hundreds or even thousands of light years away. Such was the case with the first invasion of Armageddon. Following a bout of strange and unnatural events, armed rebellion inexplicably broke out in half a dozen hives. The revolts were quickly put down on Armageddon Secundus, but amongst the more widely scattered hives of Armageddon Prime, they proved more difficult to eradicate. As the planetary forces seemed capable of dealing with the revolt, no additional units were sent from the Imperium. After all, the planet was a very long way from the Eye of Terror, and no one suspected any more sinister cause for the revolts than civil unrest. Busy containing the rebellion, Imperial forces were caught by surprise when the space hulk Devourer of Stars appeared in the Armageddon system. On board was an enormous Chaos army led by the demon Primarch Angron. Chaos Marines from the World Eaters chapter and hordes of demonic creatures poured from the space hulk and swept across the land. The insidious effects of chaos were quickly felt, as nearly half the planetary army turned traitor. The few remaining loyal defenders were quickly routed from Armageddon Prime. Falling back through the jungles in the south, the survivors joined up with the units that had been left on Armageddon Secundus and prepared to make a last-ditch defense along the rivers of the Styx and Charon. The Imperial defense was well organized. Unknown to the forces of chaos, the Space Wolves had been assigned to this sector of the Imperium. They were able to move quickly to help as soon as they received the distress messages from Armageddon. The defenders gained valuable time when Angron, replete with success, wasted weeks building victorious monuments to the Chaos Gods instead of pursuing the shattered Imperial armies into Armageddon Secundus. Angron's failure to follow up his success cost him dearly. When his army emerged from the jungles that separated Armageddon Prime from Armageddon Secundus, they found the defenders ready and waiting, and reinforced by the Space Wolves. Titanic battles erupted all along the front line as the forces of chaos crashed into the Imperial defenses. The Imperial defenders held the riverbanks of Charon, and chaos was hurled back in disorder. But Angron personally led the attack further west, smashing through the Imperial lines and leading his forces towards Infernus and Helsreach hives. It was at this moment that Logan, Lord of the Space Wolves, played his trump card. A full company of Grey Knights, whose assistance Logan had requested as soon as he was aware of the dangers that faced Armageddon. Only the Grey Knights had the ability to truly defeat an entity such as Angron. They arrived just as the Chaos forces surged towards Infernus and Helsreach hives. Teleporting directly into the presence of Angron at the center of his demonic horde, the Grey Knights defeated the Demon Prince, hurling his spirit back into the warp, from where he did not return for over 100 years. At the same time, the Space Wolves launched a massive counterattack. The forces of chaos were routed, and only the World Eaters managed to retreat back to the Space Hulk and escape into the warp. The Imperial victory was complete and overwhelming. Following Angron's defeat on Armageddon, the Inquisition, fearing chaos corruption and the spread of forbidden knowledge, initiated a purge under Lord Inquisitor Gesme Kisneros. Civilians were sterilized in labor camps, and surviving Imperial Guardsmen were ambushed and destroyed. The Space Wolves, led by Great Wolf Logan Grimnar, opposed these actions, protecting survivors and clashing with the Grey Knights and Inquisition fleets in a tense standoff. Despite assurances, purges escalated, forcing Grimnar's intervention to shield escaping transports. A fickle Cold War ensued, with the Wolves blocking Inquisition operations without initiating direct conflict. This culminated in a botched negotiation, where Grimnar struck down Grey Knight's Grandmaster Joros in retaliation for an ambush. Hostilities escalated, with the Wolves openly attacking Inquisition ships. Kisneros retaliated by assembling a massive fleet to confront Fenris, backed by the Red Hunters and Grey Knights, including the respected Hyperion. Upon arrival, negotiations with Bjorn the Fell-Handed failed, leading to a catastrophic space battle. Grimnar personally slew Kisneros during the engagement, though mutual losses forced Bjorn to broker a reluctant ceasefire. The Inquisition retreated, and the Wolves ended their campaign against them. The conflict left deep scars. The Grey Knights suffered irreplaceable losses, and relations between the Space Wolves and the Imperium remain fraught with mistrust and animosity. The Hive World of Armageddon. It's the principal world in the sector that shares its name. The planet lies roughly 10,000 light-years to the galactic northeast of Terra. It's a vital node at the center of the sector's navigational channels, and its many weapons shops are responsible for supplying arms to Imperial Guard regiments several thousand light-years away. The loss of Armageddon would pose a serious threat to the Imperium's power in this area of the galaxy, as was proved when the massive Chaos host invaded in the mid-41st millennium. Although that titanic battle has long since passed into history, a more recent conflict has shown how vulnerable the Imperium's control is. In the year 941 of the 41st millennium, the Ork warlord Ghazghull Returns invaded Armageddon at the head of a massive Ork horde. At the time, Armageddon was under the command of Overlord Hermann von Straub, who was once described by Princeps Prime Curtis Mannheim of the Iron Skull's Titan Legion as the greatest waste of flesh and bone born in the last 500 years. Von Straub's complete lack of preparation cost the Imperium dearly. Even when a space hulk of massive size was sighted in the Armageddon system, von Straub did nothing to investigate or report its appearance to other Imperial authorities. When the space hulk dubbed World Killer crashed onto the western continent of Armageddon Prime, von Straub deployed his planetary defense force regiments gradually, and they were decimated by the vastly superior Ork armies. Armageddon Prime quickly yielded. Its supply lines were cut, and Ork warriors stormed through the tunnels of its hives. It was Commissar Yarrick who ordered the astropaths to send a signal for aid, which earned him von Straub's displeasure and his subsequent exile to Hades' hive. However, it was this act which was to ultimately save Armageddon from falling to Ghazghull. Von Straub was not concerned with the loss of Armageddon Prime, declaring that the Orks would never be able to cross the thick jungles that separated them from Armageddon Secundus. He was wrong. Ghazghull's forces swept out of the jungles and embarked on a massive conquest, crossing the Stygies and Diabolus rivers and marching on the hives of Armageddon Secundus. Von Straub ordered Princeps Mannheim to lead his Titans into battle against the Ork armies, unsupported by other forces. Mannheim had little choice but to obey, though he knew that it would lead to the destruction of his forces. Although they inflicted heavy casualties on the Orks, the Legio Metallica were all but annihilated by the numerous Ork gargants that opposed them. Everywhere the Imperial forces were being driven back in disarray. The Orks stormed Infernus Hive as the season of storms broke in full force. Refugees numbering in tens of thousands marched across the inhospitable ash dunes, dying from exposure to the harsh environment, or falling prey to the rampaging mobs of Ork speed freaks, which constantly harried them in their flight. As the Orks moved southwards, they split, descending on the Hades and Helsreach hives. When the Orks besieged the massive cities, von Straub unleashed a massive stock of virus bombs from his personal arsenals. However, the ancient devices frequently malfunctioned, and although they took a heavy toll on the unprotected Orks, many humans were lost too as missiles flew out of control and plunged into Imperium lines, or exploded in the refugee camps. At Helsreach, converted supertankers took those unable to fight across the Tempest Ocean, and once the last ship had left, those who remained swore to defend the city to the last man. Kamikaze teams charged into the Ork encampments and detonated homemade explosives, while the dockside loaders welded themselves into the armored cabs of their cranes and fought with the gigantic gargants rampaging across the city. The fighting was bitter, but in the end, Helsreach was captured by Orks. Although the battle for Armageddon had been ferocious, it was at Hades' Hive that the conflict entered a new stage of savagery and fierceness. Led by Commissar Yarrick, the defenders of Hades' Hive fought as though they were possessed. The Orks made so little headway against the resistance that Ghazghull himself joined the attack, leading his forces from the front. Thus, the stage was set for the greatest battle of attrition on Armageddon. For weeks, Ghazghull tried to break the defenders, feinting and making surprise attacks, deploying massive waves and trying to reduce the hive by bombardment. Commissar Yarrick countered every ploy, sabotaging the Ork warlord's siege engines, flanking the storming Orks, and falling back from diversionary attacks to ambush the Orks. When Ghazghull mustered all of his commandos into a huge infiltration force, Yarrick assembled volunteer cadres of men who were once maintenance workers in the hive's air and fuel ducts. A deadly battle was fought in the darkness between these volunteers and the Ork commandos, and in the end it is said that not a single commando escaped alive. As Yarrick and Ghazghull fought over Hades' Hive, the remaining Orks rumbled southwards towards the only other surviving settlements, Acheron and Tartarus. At Acheron, as the Orks made their assault, the defenders swore to die rather than surrender. Such dedication was admirable, but in the end, unnecessary. The Orks were ripped apart by the thunder of bombs and the crash of gigantic cannons as the sky overhead filled with the shapes of Space Marine Thunderhawk gunships. The Blood Angels led the reinforcements, the military commanders of Armageddon ignoring von Straub's authority to follow Dante's legendary leadership. Von Straub was arrested for his crimes against the Imperium, though he later escaped. With the coming of the Ultramarines, Salamanders and Blood Angels, the tide began to turn on Armageddon. The factories of Acheron and Tartarus churned out weapons and vehicles by their thousands, whilst the Space Marines drove out the Orks from the south. If Ghazghull had turned his attention southwards and made immediate plans to derail this sudden counterattack, Armageddon may have still fallen. However, the siege of Hades' Hive had become something more than simply a military objective. Yarrick's uncompromising resistance challenged Ghazghull's ability and reputation as a warlord, a challenge he could not back down from. The Ork warlord gathered every available warband to his army, and with this almighty force, fell upon Hades' hive with the hatred an orc only reserves for his greatest enemy. Despite desperate rationing, supplies in Hades had all but run out, and seeing the mass of orcs preparing to attack, Yarrick decided that the city could no longer stand. Those who could be were evacuated by daring shuttle runs, risking the orc anti-aircraft fire and interceptors to escape. The Space Marines arrived too late to save Hades' hive, attacking the orcs even as they smashed their way inside. Yarrick was almost slain, but his unshakable will stopped him succumbing to the near-mortal wounds he had suffered. Whilst the fate of Hades was being sealed, Ghazghull revealed the true extent of his cunning. Masses of orc reinforcements poured in from the west, intent upon Tartarus' hive in the south. If Tartarus was overrun, the industrial power in the south would be smashed, and the orcs could easily consolidate their position, while the Imperial armies were being moved down from the north. As the orcs assaulted Tartarus, their vanguard already pushing into the streets of the hive city, Dante made his move. Transporting his blood angels back to their orbiting ships, he led a massive drop pod assault into the heart of the orcs. Though horrendously outnumbered, the blood angels set out to massacre any orc unlucky enough to be caught by them. Fueled by their righteous hatred, the blood angels destroyed nearly half of the entire orc army, and it was rumored that Ghazghull himself had been slain, though this later proved to be false. Leaderless and assaulted on all sides by the Emperor's forces, the orcs refused to surrender. Some fought to the death, others slipped into the ash wastes and eventually made their way to the jungles between the two continents of Armageddon. As is the way with orcs, they were never fully eradicated from Armageddon, and it is unlikely that they ever will be. In the depths of the jungles and in the ruins of fallen hives, they continue to multiply, only to be hunted down by Imperial kill teams. Hades' hive laid shattered, whilst the rebuilding of Tartarus and Infernus had only just begun. The scars of the Second Battle of Armageddon are still plain to see. Ghazghull was not idle following his defeat in the Second Armageddon War. Retiring to his stronghold, a network of systems controlled by his forces in the Golgotha sector, he carried on with the master plan that had been revealed to him by Gork and Mork years before. If the Imperium made one terrible mistake following the Second Armageddon War, it was to consider that Ghazghull had been defeated. This was far from the truth. What the orc gods had revealed to Ghazghull, or rather what he said they had revealed to him, was that in order to destroy your foe, you must first know him. For Ghazghull, the war had been a way to learn how the Imperium would react and deal with a major invasion. In effect, Ghazghull had been doing little more than testing the Imperium's defenses. In the decades that followed the war, Ghazghull carried on with his master plan. Having learnt all he needed to know about Imperial strategy, he began practicing the tactics that he felt would lead to his enemy's defeat. As he did not want to draw undue attention to himself, these experiments were carried out on a much smaller scale than the invasion of Armageddon. From years 945 to 959 of the 41st millennium, the Imperium received numerous reports of small raids and attacks against Imperial bases and outposts that were led by Ghazghull Thraka personally. Then, in year 962 of the 41st millennium, an Imperial military base on Buka 3 was annihilated by missiles fired from an orc base hidden on an asteroid. The asteroid entered the system from deep space and bypassed all the Imperial sensors before unleashing its deadly missiles at the unsuspecting outpost. In year 972 of the 41st millennium, the Imperial agri-world of Chigon 17 was overrun by a massive force of orcs, allegedly under Ghazghull's command. Despite the fact that the Imperial Guard defenders were well equipped, They were defeated by the Orks in a lengthy guerrilla campaign, which rendered the Imperial defenses utterly useless. In year 986 of the 41st millennium, Imperial battlecruiser, the Radiant Way, along with its attending escorts, were lost with all hands in a sudden attack by Ork pirates, again led by Ghazghull. The Imperium responded in force but discovered that the Orks had disappeared by the time they arrived. Most recently, Ghazghull allied with the Ork warlord Nazdreg Erdgrub to make a vicious assault on the Imperial planet Piscina 4. The Orks used a previously unknown type of teleportation device, which enabled them to maneuver their troops directly onto the planet from a space hulk located a massive distance away from the planet. The Imperial garrison was taken completely by surprise, and only the presence of space marines from the Dark Angels chapter saved Piscina from being overrun by the alien hordes. However, this second defeat was of little consequence to Ghazghull, for with the completion and testing of his new teleportation technology, he was finally ready to unleash his full force against the Imperium. A plan that had been 50 years in the making was about to reach fruition. Amidst the wreckage of Ghazghull's first invasion of Armageddon, a lengthy investigation of the planet's readiness and defenses had begun in year 948 of the 41st millennium. In light of the strategic value of Armageddon to the Imperium, extensive works were ordered by the Adepts of Terror to secure the Armageddon system against future attacks. Sector Naval Command was transferred to the Armageddon system, and the naval facility of St. Jowan's Dock was rebuilt and expanded to accommodate all classes of warships. 3 permanently manned monitor stations were established in the outer reaches, named after 3 great heroes of the Second War of Armageddon: Mannheim, Dante, and Yarick. Ground-based and orbital defenses were rebuilt and heavily reinforced. Minefields were seeded throughout the system, and a substantial increase in the numbers of system ships and monitors were ordered. On Armageddon itself, the long process of rebuilding the hives, devastated by Ghazghull's hordes, had begun. Despite massive application of resources and manpower, the rebuilding efforts remained incomplete 50 years later. In part, this was due to the increased number of defense regiments which were raised over this period, despite a lowering of Armageddon's tithe of regiments destined for the Imperial Guard. A military council was appointed to rule over Armageddon, comprising high-ranking representatives from the Imperial Guard, Navy, Departamento Munitorum, Adeptus Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, and the governor of each of the major hives on Armageddon. The council was headed by General Kurov of the Imperial Guard, a respected veteran of the Bacchus Crusade. From the years 949 to 978 of the 41st millennium, General Kurov coordinated a series of genocidal campaigns conducted throughout the equatorial jungles between Armageddon Primus and Secundus and the icebound world of Chosin to eliminate Ork infestations, which sprang up in the aftermath of Ghazghull's invasion. 50 years passed, and Armageddon rose from the ashes, its defenses stronger and more powerful than they had ever been before. Still, it was not enough. The first signs of the coming storm was a series of attacks on systems surrounding Armageddon and other worlds nearby. First, the nearby world of Minerva suffered the depredations of Ork pirates. Then the agri-world of Ruis was likewise assailed. Over a period of months, in spite of the best efforts of the Imperial Navy, the number of merchant ships reaching Armageddon was cut by half. It was as though an unseen presence knew that the Imperial forces were bound by the need to guard the Armageddon system and were not free to patrol the sector as freely as they should. Almost overnight, the pirate raids grew into assaults on outposts and then into attacks against lightly held colonies and satellites. Soon, the first full-scale planetary invasions began. 24 Imperial worlds came under attack in as many hours, and the astropaths of Armageddon received constant reports of yet more Ork assaults. Every consultation of the Emperor's tarot showed bloodshed, destruction, and the sign of the beast resurgent. Rumors spread that Ghazghull was returning to wreak his vengeance, and soon even the most obstinate bureaucrat could no longer deny that an Ork horde of gargantuan proportions was engulfing the Armageddon sector. After Task Force Trajan was presumed lost battling Orks in the Desdina system, General Kurov sent forth a call to nearby Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters to muster in defense of Armageddon. On the day of the Emperor's ascension, 57 years to the day after the first Ork invasion, Augur probes registered a massive disruption in the Imperium as an Ork fleet tore its way back into reality, and Ghazghull's hordes descended on Armageddon once more. An alert from Monitor Station. Dante was cut off in mid-transmission as the Ork ships swept past in their hundreds. The Monitor Station's final reports indicated an Ork fleet moving into the system, comprising 50 Ork cruisers and over 300 escort vessels, accompanying at least 4 space hulks. The forces of Armageddon were placed on full alert, and 7 Imperial cruiser squadrons, led by the Apocalypse-class battleships, His Will and Triumph, departed St. Joan's Dock within 24 hours. The Imperial fleet under Admiral Parole entered battle 5 days later, catching the lead elements of the Ork fleet in an ambush around the high-gravity world of Pellucidar. 60 Ork attack ships were blasted out of the void by Imperial fire in the initial engagement, without the loss of a single Imperial ship. Then Parole's ships were engaged by heavy squadrons of Ork kill cruisers and swarms of bombers racing ahead of the main body of the Ork fleet. The Imperial ships fought valiantly, their weapon batteries pounding the crude Ork vessels into scrap, ravening lance beams incinerating wave after wave of bombers. Nonetheless, the Ork fleet outnumbered that of Armageddon 6-1, and the Imperial ships were gradually battered back. The Orks made suicidal rushes against the Imperial gun lines with unbounded ferocity, losing a dozen of their ships in exchange for a single Imperial vessel. At the height of the engagement, Admiral Parole received comm bursts from the Yarrick and Mannheim monitor stations, warning of 3 more Ork fleets entering the edges of the system. Almost simultaneously, the Triumph was bracketed by 5 Ork kill cruisers and crippled by their combined heavy gunfire and mass teleport attacks. Realizing that his duty lay in preserving the fleet for a protracted conflict, Admiral Parole reluctantly gave the order for a general disengagement. The doomed monitor stations were overwhelmed a few hours later. By their last count, the combined Ork fleets numbered in excess of 2,000 ships and at least 12 space hulks, the largest number of hulks ever to assail a world of the Imperium in its 10,000-year history. Admiral Parole, his command reduced to 5 squadrons of cruisers and a single operational battleship, could do little more than mount hit and run attacks against the massive Ork armadas as they moved in system. Imperial reinforcements would arrive soon, and then Parole could hope that Ghazghull's control of space could be challenged with some hope of success. In the meantime, Parole's escorts and light cruisers harried the Orks as best as they could, distracting and drawing off their foes into baited traps and minefields, doing whatever was in their power to reduce the tidal wave of Ork machines arriving in system. To their dismay, the Imperial Navy ships encountered dozens of crude asteroid fortresses in the normally vulnerable tail of the Ork fleets. These heavily armed weapons platforms proved difficult to attack directly, but the very presence of such unusual numbers of them seemed to indicate some more sinister design at work. Surprisingly, the Orks did not turn aside to capture St. Joan's Dock. Instead, they subjected it to a 6-day-long bombardment as the Ork fleets moved past, enlivened by repeated attacks from assault boat squadrons. Ork warriors succeeded in establishing themselves throughout the lower sections of the dock, and although the facility remained in Imperial hands, it was rendered virtually useless by damage from the bombardment and constant Ork raids. On Armageddon, the final weeks before the Ork fleet's arrival were occupied with frenzied preparations. Titan legions fired up their ancient plasma reactors and took up defensive positions around the hives. Imperial Guard regiments were rallied and dug in. Space Marines from over 20 chapters dispersed into the wastelands and mountains to prepare to face the aliens. Imperial merchant vessels rushed to get more reinforcements to the planet. The last transport to touch down carried a legend. Commissar Yarrick set foot on Armageddon for the first time in 20 years to the thunderous cheers of the populace. The old commissar met with the military council that very night and advised them on Ghazghull's most recent tactics and strategies, adding a dire warning against underestimating the warlord's capabilities. Many said he had become old and weary, bowed down with the horrific prospect of the coming invasion. Those who knew him well could see the fierce determination that still burned in his single eye. General Kurov had always been renowned for his judgment of men in battle, and he was deeply impressed by Yarrick's drive and intelligence. He requested that Yarrick take over leadership of the military council for the duration of the current crisis, and to the relief of all, Yarrick agreed. 6 weeks after entering the Armageddon system, the vast armada of Ghazghull's forces went into battle with the space stations and weapons platforms in high orbit over the planet. Those who had hoped that the powerful orbital defenses of Armageddon would keep the Orks at bay were soon shown to be hopelessly deluded. The orbital battle raged for 3 days and 2 nights. But by dawn of the 3rd day, the skies were filled with the vapor trails of Ork landing pods and the incandescent meteors of attack ships carving through the skies. Hades' hive, still a virtual ruin after the last war, was the first to fall. In an act of terrible vengeance, Ghazghull chose not to fight again at Hades. Instead, the entire hive and its inhabitants were smashed by giant asteroids dropped from orbiting space hulks. This act of careless annihilation was but the prelude to the bloodshed which was to follow. As the fires of Hades' destruction lit the eastern horizon, the first Ork drop legions clashed with Imperial forces near Vulcanus, Acheron, and Deathmire. Ground-based defense lasers and missile silos took a terrible toll on the Orks as they landed, but the survivors regrouped and assailed the defenses with such terrible ferocity that soon more and more of the horde was reaching the planet's surface unscathed. Feral Orks swept down from the Palidus Mountains and out of the equatorial jungles to join the growing hordes. Where the defenses proved too strong to be taken by direct assaults, huge mobs of Orks and their war machines were teleported directly into battle from the hulks above. As the ground defenses fell silent on the 3rd day of the landings, Yarrick ordered every remaining aircraft on Armageddon to be thrown into the battle in a desperate attempt to destroy as much of Ghazghull's hordes as possible before they reached the ground. The sulfur-yellow skies over Armageddon became interwoven with twisting trails, as thousands of Ork aerial bombers dueled with Imperial thunderbolts and furies. The Imperial craft had the advantage in that they could return to their armored air bases to refuel and rearm, whereas the Orks had to reserve enough fuel to climb back up to their terror ships and hulks in orbit. But soon, the Orks secured ground bases, and the battle turned against the brave Imperial pilots as the crushing numbers of the Orks was brought fully to bear. As the aerial battles reached their height 5 days after the landings, Acheron Hive fell to the Orks without warning, captured by treachery from within. Garbled reports spoke of power grids sabotaged and the Orks boiling out from secret access tunnels at the very heart of the metropolis. The instigator of these foul crimes was soon revealed as none other than the infamous Hermann von Strab. He took over the hive as its new overlord, announcing that it was his divine right to rule over Armageddon. Ork brute squads stood ready to silence any dissenters who doubted von Strab's determination. Despicably, much of the old nobility in Acheron welcomed von Strab as a long-lost prince, choosing to ignore the fact that he had thrown in his lot with some of the most dangerous Xenos the galaxy had ever seen. On the same day that Acheron fell, massed Ork infantry surged over the 20 square miles of defenses atop Volcanus Mount, just beyond the hive's outer suburbs. 17 garrison regiments of Armageddon hive militia were routed, and the Orks captured many weapons and fortifications intact. Volcanus itself was soon besieged, surrounded by a ring of Orkish steel and relentlessly pounded by artillery. Outside Deathmire, the war went better. The Titans of Legios Tempesta and Victorum, with their supporting regiments, virtually annihilated the Ork Blackfire tribe in a 3-day running battle across the plain of Anthrand. But the Ork landers fell from the skies like a relentless storm, and fighting spread across Armageddon like a wildfire, until every hive and factory complex was embroiled. In many places, Ork attacks were beaten off, but again and again the Orks would regroup and attack within hours, stretching the defenders to their limit. As Yarrick had predicted, Ghazghull's strategies proved deadly. The Orks kept an iron grip on Armageddon's skies. Orbital bombardments and aerial bombers pounded Imperial forces wherever they tried to form a battle line, pinning them in place while further landings were made to surround them. Where the Orks were outnumbered, they fought a guerrilla war, striking at their foes and withdrawing into the harsh wastelands before retribution could arrive. Ghazghull had learned the lessons of Chigon 17 well, and deliberately prepared his plans so that the fighting was scattered and chaotic, precisely the conditions in which Ork warbands thrive, and Imperial regiments were denied the support and coordination they needed to fight back effectively. The only force which consistently defeated the Orks was the Adeptus Astartes. The Space Marines tirelessly scoured the hinterlands of Armageddon on search and destroy missions to eliminate them at any opportunity. As the battles raged on the planet, Ghazghull unleashed another of his carefully prepared surprises. Incredibly, dozens of the great asteroid fortresses encountered by Admiral Parol's ships began to descend from orbit. Slowed by powerful force fields, rockets, and modified cannons, the Ork rocks made landings in the green equatorial jungles and across Armageddon Primus and Secundus. Many were lost to ground fire or accidents, but each one that survived became a bastion for the Orks, a rallying point and a ready-made fortress. As well as their huge guns and missile batteries, the rocks contained giant teleport arrays, like those first used by Ghazghull in his Piscina campaign. These were employed to teleport down an endless stream of reinforcements, including gargants and heavy artillery. Commissar Yarrick personally led attacks with Cadian shock troops, supported by the Titans of Legio Metallica and Legio Ignatum, which destroyed several of the fortresses, but bloody battles around many others consumed whole regiments in hours. For the rest of the war, the Space Marines bore the brunt of eliminating the Ork fortresses, the Salamanders chapter winning particular acclaim for their successes against fortresses along Hemlock River. Mysteriously, the Orks also made landings in the fire wastes and deadlands to the north and south of the main continent of Armageddon. Even Yarrick was surprised. These grim, forbidding lands had always been believed to be uninhabitable and utterly valueless. Their value to Ghazghull became apparent when weeks later, hundreds of tanker-sized Ork submersibles rose from the polluted waters and made landings at Tempestora and Helsreach. Surprise was total. Tempestora fell within days, and the dockyards of Helsreach were soon captured. Only a bitter defense by the Helsreach Hive gang militias, with supporting companies of stormtroopers and space marines which had been rushed to the area, prevented the Orks overrunning the entire hive. 14 days after the initial Ork landings, the first major confrontation between Ork and Imperial war engines occurred. A 10-day battle raged over the Diabolus factory complex as the Gargant mobs clashed with the Titans of Legio Crucius. 6 Titans and 8 Gargants were destroyed in the fighting, and many others needed months of repairs before they could fight again. The Diabolus complex was wrecked during the battle, its foundries and machine shops blasted apart or crushed by giant fighting machines. In the aftermath of the battle, Ork speed cults swiftly encircled Infernus Hive, cutting it off from all reinforcements. As the defenders pondered how to lift the siege, reports came in of a vast Ork horde rounding the Palladus Mountains from the northeast. Soon, the horde was visible from the hive spire, a great sea of warriors which seemed to fill the empty expanse of the ash wastes. Towering Gargants strode through the tide like great ships rolling on a green sea. The guttural war chants of the Orks could be heard from over 20 miles away, the ground shaking with their progress. Worst of all, the countless banner poles swaying over the horde bore the personal glyph of the mighty Ghazghull himself. As the skies darkened beneath the shadow of Ork hulks high above, and the first orbital bombardments crashed down, the citizens of Infernus knew that their doom was upon them. They made what preparations they could with eerie calm, trusting their souls to the Emperor as they built barricades or distributed weapons and ammunition to the troops. They tried to take inspiration from the legends of Commissar Yarrick and how he made the Orks pay for every inch of ground at Hades' Hive. Not all were brave enough to face their doom. Thousands fled into the wastes to be killed or captured by speed cults, which circled the hive like vultures over a carcass. The Adeptus Arbites soon moved to secure the hive, turning back or executing any who failed in their duty to the Emperor. As Ghazghull's horde came within range, the last great siege guns of Infernus pounded at them, lobbing 1,000-pound shells into the mass of greenskins until return fire from the orbiting hulks destroyed them. In the brief lull that followed, Ghazghull delivered to the defenders of Infernus a messenger. It was Colonel Gortar of the Chem Dogs, horribly mutilated and missing his eyes and hands. The message the colonel bore was a simple one, which would be heard many times across Armageddon in the months to come. Surrender or die. That brings us to the end of this narrated lore episode. I sincerely hope you enjoyed, and I thank you for listening. Please let me know what you'd like me to narrate next. I hope you have a good day or good night, wherever you are.